class. So as far as I recall, I didn't really go into the laws of inheritance in Judaism before. So I decided to give it a go. I don't know how many people it applies to or to whatever extent, but I think it's interesting either way. So here's our introduction. In our parsha, the parsha is Pinchas, and he's a character, and there's a whole story about him, but I'll skip that for now. We learn about the laws of inheritance through the famous story of the daughters of Tzalafchad. Does everybody remember the story of the daughters of Tzalafchad? Does anybody not remember it? I don't hear either way, so I'll just go into it really briefly. Actually, the text is going to have it in a little bit, so we'll go there. It turns out that Moses was not given the law of what happens when somebody dies without sons but has daughters. In that story, we also learn about the next of kin hierarchy as it relates to inheritance. The Torah laws of inheritance are problematic in all kinds of ways when looked at from a modern perspective. They clearly advantage males as opposed to females, which can be seen as sexist. They are tribal in nature, and the Torah restricts certain marriages to keep property in a tribe. They also advantage the father's firstborn as opposed to other siblings, which seems unfair to the other siblings and can lead to increased sibling rivalry. They seem to prejudice natural birth over cesarean section birth. And you can keep going on and on, right? Other issues include spouses. You'll see in the next of kin hierarchy, there's no mention of spouses. Unmarried daughters before and after they reach the age of maturity, dowries, converts, minors, miscarriages, last will and testament, bank account interest, debt, liens, stocks, trusts, right? This, our modern system is very complex. Trying to take laws that were written, thousands of years ago and apply them today can get really tricky. And then we also have this sort of, depending on your perspective, overriding law called Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land applies, but there are some, depending on the perspective, there are certain restrictions on that law. For example, where some people say that only applies when it's interactions between people and the government or the community and the government, but not when it's interactions between one Jew and another. This class is far from exhaustive, as I've learned preparing for it, but it's hopefully a good introduction to some of the issues. All right, so the quote from our parsha that kind of got me down this tangent. But Tigravna benas Tzalafchad, the daughters of Tzalafchad, of the Manassite or Menashe tribe, family, son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Menashe, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses and Elazar the priest, right, because Aaron had died in the last parsha, the chieftains and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, right? So this was a real public display. And remember, assuming that this is in order, we know that not everything in the Torah is necessarily in order, but assuming it is, so this is coming in the heels of the Korach revolt. And they seem to be challenging Moses or the law, which takes a lot of guts considering the last people who challenged Moses' authority ended up swallowed into the ground. So they said, number 3 here, our father died in the wilderness, let's see if I put that there, then you can see about where I am. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, right? So they even mention that, I acknowledge it, which banded together against the Lord, but died for his own sin, which suggests that their theology, their belief was any time that somebody died, the reason that they died was because of sin. And he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he has no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. So instead of Moses saying, oh yeah, I remember I was sitting on Mount Sinai on the 34th day and God told me this, he didn't have an answer. So Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a hereditary where am I?
Right.
Yeah, I went a little too far here. The plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen and transfer their father's share to them. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. All right, so we're at 9. If he has no daughters, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brother. If his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. This shall be the law or procedure for the Israelites in accordance with the Lord's command to Moses. Right? Seems pretty straightforward. It can save a lot of legislation. We have a hierarchy here. But of course, it's never that simple. Following the victory of the daughters of Zelophehad, the leaders of her Manasseh tribe realized that they could lose property if any of Zelophehad's daughters marry outside of the tribe. Zelophehad's daughters would take their inheritance with them to their husband's tribe because property was seen as the man's. They went to Moses, who didn't have an answer for them either, and Moses went back to God for an answer. This is not in our, I don't think this is in our parsha, at least I didn't see it. The family heads of the clan and descendants of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, one of the Josephite clans, right? Because the Manasseh clan or tribe was actually, Joseph had 2 sons, and each one became their own tribe, as opposed to the Levites, who had a whole separate set of laws. So for most things, when they count the 12 tribes, they're actually counting the 2 sons of Manasseh in there and not the Levites. The 2 sons of Joseph, yeah, okay. They said, the Lord commanded my Lord to assign the land to the Israelites as shares by lot. And when they say by lot, they mean for each tribe. And my Lord was further commanded by the Lord to assign the share of our kinsman Zelophehad to his daughters. Now, if they marry persons from another Israelite tribe, their share will be cut off from our ancestral portion and be added to the portion of the other tribe. Anyway, I'm gonna jump past this. The point is that God says, you know what, you're right. Yeah, I'll read it. I changed it. No inheritance of the Israelites may, if they marry out, they're going to lose it, and so the law changes again, saying that they're not allowed to marry out. Right, and I can see this turning into a movie. If somebody falls in love, and then they have to choose between the property. or the man they love. It also brings back thoughts of the book of Ruth, where at the end of the story there's this whole transactional aspect of it, and again that it's related to these laws of inheritance. All right, so according to the Mishnah below, the daughter would not automatically inherit, but rather they first need to check if the son had children, right? In the simple understanding of the text, it suggests that if there's no son, then it automatically goes to the daughter. But the rabbis understood it differently. So this is from Bava Batra, Mishnah. The order of precedence with regards to inheritance is this. The verse states, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance to his daughters. This teaches that a son precedes a daughter. So far, so good. Additionally, all descendants of a son precede a daughter. A daughter precedes the brothers of the deceased. Additionally, all descendants of a daughter precede the brothers. So basically, when you go through the next of kin, it's not just that the son, the daughter, or the brother, whoever it is, but also any descent. If they had children, it goes to them before it jumps to the next person. As can be seen from the Talmud below, this issue in which the daughter does not inherit if the son had children, a son or a daughter, was a major issue of contention between the rabbis and the Sadducees. Right? So just a quick reminder, the Sadducees, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I recall, they were the ones who basically said, follow the word of the Torah, and don't, the rabbis don't have any authority to interpret or add or subtract. That there was, and especially around the time when Christianity was founded, there were major issues with this. And this was one of the key issues of contention, is whether you go to the next level in terms of children of the person that's not alive, or it jumps automatically from son to daughter. Any questions so far? Got you. All right. Either everybody's muted and has no questions, or everybody's sleeping. Either one is okay.
Not sleeping.
Oh, good. I feel better now. Okay. So Rav Huna says, again, this is Bava Batra, that Rav says, with regard to anyone who says that a daughter of the deceased should inherit the estate of her father along with the daughter of the son of the deceased, even if he is a prince of the Jewish people, one should not listen to him, as this is nothing other than an act of the Sadducees. Right? So there's a couple of issues that we'll come back to later as well. So one is in terms of the son inheriting before the daughter. The second one is also an issue of birth order. The firstborn son gets a double portion. Anyway, continuing. So they're acting according to the Sadducees and runs counter to the ruling of the Mishnah that the descendants of a son inherit before a daughter. As it is taught in the Breita, a Breita is an aspect of, in the Talmud, that's not necessarily law. In Megillat Tanya, which describes various minor holidays on which it is forbidden to fast or eulogize, on the 24th of Tevet, we returned our law, i.e. the halacha, the rabbinic authority, was established in accordance with the opinion of the sages after having been dictated by the Sadducees. As the Sadducees would say, a daughter should inherit the estate of her father along with the daughter of the son of the deceased. All right, continuing along this, I brought another couple of quotes, also from Bava Batra. The Breita continues, Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai joined them to discuss their ruling and said to them, imbeciles! I believe in modern terminology, we would say this is an ad hominem attack, but he's backing it up. But it shows how passionate they were about this when they're starting to call each other names. Imbeciles, from where do you derive this ruling? And there was no person that answered him anything except for one old man interesting, they don't mention his name, but they mention that he's old. It kind of has a little bit of a derogatory sense to it, even though generally we, in Judaism, we honor the old. They're supposed to have more wisdom. One old man who was chattering at him and saying that it is a fortiori inference. I had to look that up, and my understanding is that it's when there's two conflicting arguments and one has more evidence. The newer one has more evidence than the old one. And just as the daughter of the deceased son, who comes to claim her inheritance from her grandfather by virtue of his son, it's really, the language is really complicated, but I'm just bringing these things to show the general idea. So if you're not following completely, it's okay. Just as a daughter of the deceased son, who comes to claim her inheritance from her grandfather by virtue of his son, inherits her grandfather's property, so too, with regard to the deceased's own daughter, who comes to inherit by virtue of the deceased, all the more so is it not clear that she should inherit his property. I think we get one more insult before we move on from the topic. I may not have brought it. I don't know. Let's see. So this is by 116a, and that was, it is a continuation. But will our perfect Torah not be as worthy as your frivolous speech? As your inference is fallacious. Didn't call him an imbecile, but, What is notable about the inheritance of a daughter of the deceased son? Yeah, it is notable in that her right is enhanced in that she inherits from her paternal grandfather together with the brothers of her father. Would you say that the same applies with regard to the deceased daughter? Anyway, the Sadducees' a fortiori inference is thereby disproved. The Gemara concludes that since the Sadducees had no counter-argument, the sages were victorious over them, and they established that day, the 24th of Tevet, as a minor festival to celebrate the establishment. Right? So there was a real power struggle between what came to be known as Rabbinic Judaism versus this other group, which said, you don't. It's a little bit like the Jehovah's Witness, who claim that they only follow, the word of the Bible, and there's no interpretation, even though there's always interpretation. Anyway, moving along. So what do you do when there are no known relatives? Right? Unfortunately, this happens. The Talmud indicates that an extremely thorough investigation must be done. I mean, we're not just talking about a quick, Ancestry.com here. The Gemara asks, how so? This is a continuation of something else, obviously. How is the investigation performed? When he has no offspring at all, the Gemara answers, the family lineage that determines the inheritance is successively examined up until Reuben, son of Jacob. So we're talking going back to biblical times. All right, I'll skip the rest of it, but you get the idea. So imagine trying to settle an estate, but not being able to because you have to go back to biblical times to figure out if there's any descendants. All right. Even in a case where a daughter doesn't meet the requirement to inherit, she's still entitled to some money for her dowry. And I didn't really dig deep into this, but the rabbis basically said that even though it doesn't say explicitly so, the needs of the wife and the unmarried daughters need to be met outside of the inheritance. And the court can decide how much those needs are. So this is a Mishnah from Ketubot. If an orphan was given in marriage by her mother or her brothers with her consent, and they gave her a dowry of 100 or 50 zuz, she may, when she reaches majority age, legally claim from them the amount that was due to her. Right? So when they say give, there was promised to her. Rabbi Judah says if the father had given his first daughter in marriage, the second daughter must receive as much as the first. The sages say sometimes a man is poor and becomes rich, or rich and becomes poor. Rather, the estate should be evaluated and the appropriate amount given to her, right? Because just because the person gave one amount at a certain time, they may not have that amount anymore. I know this is an issue with people who get divorced. I know 2 men who were thrown into prison because they didn't keep up their alimony payments when one of them was my old boss. Business turned south and he couldn't keep up with it. And the judge didn't believe him. He said, "You're squirreling away money and assets," which he may or may not have been doing. I don't know. You need to pay the full amount. He didn't, and he went to jail for several months. And I remember a similar case, somebody else I knew. But in this case, the Mishnah is acknowledging that possibility. So ideally, you would give the same amount, but, reality doesn't always line up. All right. Besides for the issue of girls, women inheriting, there are other interesting aspects in Jewish inheritance laws. For example, according to Maimonides, one cannot veer far from the Torah. The Torah. Forget the bar. One cannot veer far from the Torah next of kin order, even with the last will and testament. Yet, a discussion in the Talmud seems to suggest that one can make special requests, that they may be honored, but not in all cases. And as I'll mention later, the rabbis have allowed certain what could be perceived as loopholes or legal fictions, or call it whatever you want, workarounds, but there are ways of executing a will and distributing money the way you want to. The problem is that there isn't universal agreement. So depending on who's judging might determine if the will is valid or not. All right, so Mishnah Torah, inheritance. A person, again, this is Maimonides, a person is not able to inherit to someone who does not qualify to inherit. Oh, this is my own translation. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, in Sefaria, they're making really good progress, but there's still a ton of the material that's not translated. So this is my own translation. A person is not able to inherit to someone who does not qualify to inherit, and should not disinherit from one who is qualified to inherit, even though the money belongs to him. So in most aspects of finances, a person has a lot of leeway with their finances in Jewish law. They can make conditions. There's even an aspect, for example, at a marriage where somebody can say, I'm marrying on the condition of X, Y, and Z, which is why there's an issue. Rabbis will generally have a problem if you use a diamond ring for marriage because of this issue, which is if the person thinks that they're getting a really valuable diamond and you put a cubic zirconium or a really lousy quality one in there, then the person can feel like they were misled and it gets tricky. So there's making conditions and then there's perceived conditions that also apply. But the Rambam is saying in these cases, those conditions don't apply, and you have to follow the hierarchy of inheritance. Because it is stated in the chapter that addresses inheritance, quote, "And it shall be for the children of Israel for a statute of justice," right? And there's generally understood to be different kinds of mitzvot. There are rational ones that we probably would have come to on our own at some point anyway, like don't kill, don't steal, and all of that. And then there are ones that are laws that are not necessarily rational. This one is presented as a statute, which are considered the ones that are not necessarily rational, and you don't have as much flexibility with them. Telling us that the statute should not be altered and making conditions does not help. This is true even if he commanded when he was on his deathbed, even if it is in writing. Right? So that's pretty strong there. But as you'll see, the reality is quite different. So here's just one discussion of many about it from the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was before Maimonides, but I just did that in this order to show the strong statement from Maimonides, even though it's generally not followed. And it's also really important to remember when studying the Talmud that it's not considered as authoritative. So there are opinions presented, but then you might find another place where there's a different opinion presented, and there's different ways of ultimately deciding what the ruling should be. Sometimes it's the majority, sometimes it's different people or precedent. All right, so from Ketubot, right? So Ketubah is that marriage document. A certain older man came and talked before somebody. With regard to one who says upon his deathbed, "Give a shekel to my sons for each week." The court assesses the son's needs, and if it is appropriate that the court gives them a selah, which is worth 2 shekels, the court gives them a selah. Basically, his request is not being honored. Had the father known they would need the additional money, he would have begrudged them. So the assumption is he said that because he thought that's what they needed, but the court can override that. There's inflation, whatever. But if he said, "Give them only a shekel," the court gives them only a shekel. Right? So this seems to indicate that there is some flexibility. Because their father spoke explicitly, there's no room to question his intentions. If they need more, they should take charitable aid. Right? The father's no dummy. He knows that things change, and he still said that. So why are we pretending to know better than, to assume his intentions when he explicitly put them out? And if he said, if they die without inheritors, others should inherit in their stead, then whether he said give a shekel or whether he said don't give more than a shekel, the court gives them only a shekel, since it is clear that he wants the inheritance to be doled out in such a way that it will remain intact for whoever will receive it. Right? And so this kind of addresses what I was talking about before, which is there's certain things that are excluded from the inheritance. So for example, in I think executors generally are allowed to charge a certain amount to the estate for the work that they do, and that goes outside of the inheritance in U.S. law. So the needs of the children is being addressed there. So it's not explicitly challenging Maimonides, but it's showing that there are exceptions to be looked at. Continuing in Ketubah to the next page, right? And in the Talmud, each page has an A or B side. So you got to watch out for that. So before we were in 69B, now we're going to 70A. Reb Chisda said, that Mar Ukva said, right? There's always authority if you can say who said it before you, as opposed to this is your own opinion. The halacha is that whether he says give a shekel or whether he says do not give more than a shekel, the court gives the sons enough for all of their needs. The Gemara asks, but how could we disregard the father's words and give more when the father said to give only a shekel? We maintain that the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that it is a mitzvah to fulfill the statements of the dead. Right? So now we're being presented with a very clear principle that when a person says something before they die, that we should honor it. And that's going to come in conflict with the hierarchy of inheritance, because we need to determine how far that goes. How then may the father's instructions be ignored? The Gemara answers, this principle applies only in other matters in which there is a mitzvah to fulfill his wishes. But in this instance, it is certainly preferable to him that his children be appropriately provided for. So again, it's kind of going into the mind of the person and saying, a father wouldn't deprive their children, and they must have just miscalculated the needs. And the reason that he said this statement, limiting the allowance, is that he came to encourage them to adopt thrifty spending habits. All right, fascinating. We're really doing some mind reading here of what his intentions were. So I don't know how interesting this is to any of you guys, but some of the material that I found really helpful were in these two sites. So if anybody wants to dig deeper into it, I believe you should be able to click on these links. I might be wrong. Dan, you're able to click on the links, right? All right, you may not be there. If you're not, I'll post it on my Rabbi Sam Facebook page as well. No? Does somebody want to try clicking it?
I did. You can't.
You can't? Okay, so I'll post it there if you want it, because it's a long URL. Anyway, so the first one is sort of a light review. The second one is actually a scholarly review from Hofstra, where they really break it down, comparing Jewish law to secular law and how and when different options would apply. It's really fascinating stuff to me, but I realize that different people are fascinated by different things. All right, so I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so we're talking about, all right, I'll just dig into it now. I'll go back. The Gemara offers another refutation of the opinion of Rav Sheshet, common here, a proof from a Mishnah. A one-day-old child inherits property and bequeaths property. One can infer that if the child is 1 day old, yes, he inherits property, but a fetus does not. Right? And so the question becomes, does the person need to be an adult in order to inherit? If they're not an adult at the time when the person dies, do they still inherit the property? And there's a whole discussion back and forth. Ultimately, there's a concept of an apotropos, which is basically a Greek word that made it into the Talmudic lexicon, which means the guardian. And so you establish, if there's nobody to look out for funds for the child, you establish a guardian so that they can still get what's due to them. So now switching gears, the firstborn son inherits a double portion, right? In modern times, this is, we don't value being the firstborn very much, and why the firstborn son and not the firstborn daughter. And so there's all kinds of ways of getting around it. But in ancient times, the firstborn was basically seen as replacing the continuation of the person themselves, and their status was a lot higher. And then the question also becomes, how do you do the math? Do you divide it up into equal parts? So let's say there's 3 children. Do you divide it up into 4 and give the firstborn 2 parts and the other ones each a part? Or do you divide it into thirds and then give it? And the numbers are different. So my understanding, although I'm not sure if everybody agrees, is that you do it in thirds. And so the firstborn is getting even more. The main text that...
I didn't follow how you do it in thirds. It seems logical to do it in quarters.
So to do it in thirds, so let's say there's $12, right? So if you do in quarters, then it's $3 and the $3 each, and the Bechor gets $6.
Right.
If you do it in quarters, it would be 4.
No, that was quarters.
Right.
Thirds.
If you do it in thirds, thank you.
Yeah.
Then it would be 4. Yeah, I'm not really sure exactly.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah,
it seems sort of logical to do it in quarters, but I don't know.
Yeah, but I did see a place where it said to do it in thirds, which I don't remember exactly how they came to that conclusion and how they executed it. It may be in one of those links above.
Okay.
All right. So in terms of the double portion, this main source text is talking about polygamy of all things, and a person who hates one of his wives. Why he doesn't get divorced? Well, maybe he got divorced, but he still had a kid with her. If a man has 2 wives, one loved and the other unloved, which sounds nicer than hate, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one. When he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved one and disregard the son of the unloved one who is older. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses, since he is the first fruit of his vigor. However you understand that. The birthright is his due. All right. So this is from the Mishnah of Bechorah, the Mishnah of the firstborn. The firstborn takes a double portion in the property of his father, but does not take a double portion of the mother's property. And he does not take a double portion in its increase in value after his death. So it's at the time of death, the value. So if there's interest after, that doesn't count. Nor in what is fit to come into possession of his estate, rather in what he holds now. So it has to be cash in hand and not what's coming to him. And this is where things get really tricky in terms of bank accounts, in terms of debts, what should or shouldn't be counted. Neither a woman collects for her ketubah, nor daughters for their inheritance, and nor the yavam. None of them take a double portion in its increase in value after his death. So at the time of death, you do an inventory, and it's based on that. Nor is what is fit to come into possession of his estate, rather in what he holds now. Okay. So the following couple of quotes are from this book called Gray Matter, written by Chaim Yachter. I'm assuming he's a Rabbi Chaim Yachter, but I don't know since it doesn't say Rabbi. Estate planning, introduction to the laws of Yerusha, which means inheritance, and the ethics of Jewish estate planning. The Torah commands us to give the firstborn male a double portion of his father's estate. Full presentation of the details concerning special entitlements appears in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Thus, if the deceased was survived by 5 sons, the Bechor receives 2/6. This might be it. 2/6 of the inheritance, and the other sons each receive 1/6. Are you with me, Shelley? All right. All right. Continuing from him, there are several important exceptions to this seemingly simple halacha. First, a son born by cesarean section does not qualify for the double portion, which is fascinating.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, my sound was off. If I may just go back. So I didn't exactly follow that.
So, as I understand it, if there's 5 sons, then you divide it into 6, right?
Yeah, like if there are 3 sons, you divide it into fourths. Yes, okay,
Yeah.
I got it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I got it. Thank you.
The firstborn double.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not sure everybody agrees with him on this. I seem to have that in the back of my mind, but I don't remember where. All right, so cesarean section doesn't count, and I'm not entirely sure how they came to that conclusion. But it's in the Talmud, so there it is. I'll bring it. I have a quote for it. A source for it further down. In addition, the Mishnah teaches that the Bechor, the firstborn, is entitled to receive a double share only from assets held by the decedent at the time of his death. Muchsak is the term. The Bechor, the firstborn, does not receive a double portion from the contingent assets, roi, the assets to which the descendant had a right at the time of death, but which he did not actually have in hand. For example, unpaid debts. Right? So the fact that he didn't have that money in hand, even though it was known to be owed to him, that doesn't count. There's considerable debate concerning the implementation of this rule. For example, Rabbi Vadia Yosef, who was the chief rabbi of Israel at one point, and Rabbi Yaakov Blau, who's a very well-known halachic decider, rule the money deposited in a bank is considered roi. In other words, it is not calculated in the inheritance. On the other hand, Reb Hershel Schachter records, which would be interesting, then what happens with it? Right? It's got to go to somebody. Reb Hershel Schachter records that Reb Moshe Feinstein, who is also a very well-known decider of halacha, in Hebrew the term is posek, believe that money deposited in a bank account, including the interest accumulated before death, is considered muhzak. It's considered cash in hand. Yeah.
Rabbi, I think they're arguing over whether or not the first son gets a double portion of, let's say, the bank account. It's not a question of is it inherited? It's inherited, but it's what of the inheritance goes to a double portion.
That may be true.
I think that's what the argument is.
Entitled, yeah, because that is the context that it's being brought in.
Right.
So in terms of, yeah, you might be right on that one. Okay. A similar dispute exists between Rabbi Cheskel Landau and the Aruch HaShulchan as to whether government bonds are considered roi or muhzak. All right, I already mentioned this, the cesarean section, so this is where it comes from in the Talmud. In the case of a boy born by cesarean section and the son who follows him, both of them are not considered firstborn, neither with regard to inheritance, nor with regard to redemption from a priest. Rabbi Shimon says the first son, so that's a pidyon aban. Rabbi Shimon says the first son is a firstborn with regard to inheritance if he is his father's first son, and the second son is a firstborn with regard to redemption from the priest for 5 selah coins, because he is the first to emerge from the womb, and he emerged in the usual way. The Talmud asks about the case of miscarriage, and I did not get a chance to translate this. Haba achar nefalem, somebody who comes after a miscarriage, afal pi sheyatzer rosh Nofel, even though the head of the the baby that was miscarried emerged when he was alive. Haba Afra Bechar Lenachla. Yeah, it's getting complex. But the point is that the miscarriage, depending on exactly how far it went, determines if it counts or not. The firstborn double portion law only applies to assets that are inherited. We talked about that. It's a major issue in modern times. All right. All right. So there's also questions of a convert. So for certain aspects of halacha, the children of a convert that they had before they converted don't have the status of children. And so the question becomes, who gets that property? So apparently there was a case where people were just like, as soon as the guy died, they were running to grab his things because they're like, it's free stuff. So that's a whole chapter of itself. The minors we already talked about. Interestingly, the Mishnah adds a father into the mix of the next of kin. So if there's no son, it goes to the daughter. If there's no daughter, it goes to the father, as opposed to in the Torah text where it says, if there's no daughter, it goes to the brothers. Exactly what they're basing that on, I don't know. All right, that's pretty much the gist of it. Any questions?
Just one comment for me. That was rather. I mean, I've always found inheritance and relatives. It's hard for me to keep up. I would just say that was hard for me to keep up with. Yeah,
it's much more technical.
Yeah,
but I think it's fascinating. The story of the daughters of Salafat is fascinating because it challenges the idea that Moses got all the laws on Mount Sinai, for one. So it challenges that belief. It also the fact that women, in a society where women didn't have a whole lot of voice, were able to come and advocate for themselves is fascinating.
Yeah.
They got the law changed, but then there's a partial reversal where then they if they want to get the property, they have to marry within the tribe, right? You hardly ever see that on laws that are explicit in the Torah, right? So this back and forth tells us that there is some leeway. The question is how much, but it's just a fascinating story, and it leads into all of these laws. All right, everybody.
Oh, just one question, Rabbi.
Sure.
So what is the Orthodox view of this?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
You're
so as you'll be able to see in those links, there's different ways that they work around these laws. So one is, for example, that you can create a debt without actually borrowing money. So, for example, I can say an IOU. I owe you, $20,000, right? So that money automatically, according to some opinions, goes outside of the inheritance because debts are not included. So that's one way they get around it. Another thing is gifts. You can give gifts that they also don't apply to inheritance. You give them before the person dies, even if you didn't actually, the transaction didn't happen completely, you can do a symbolic transaction with a handkerchief or something like that. and then it becomes a gift. And there's issues like this over millions of dollars that have been bequeathed to yeshivas, and I know Chabad in California had a huge case with this, where it played out in secular courts. So that's another way. There's a third. Yeah, there's also there's a lot of debate on how much weight a person has, especially on their deathbed, if they say something, how much it does or doesn't override these inheritance laws. Mm-hmm. And it seems like depending on the language that they use, if they say, I'm bequeathing, something that sounds like inheritance, mm-hmm. then it doesn't apply. If they mm-hmm. use language of a gift or of a debt, then it might apply.
Uh-huh. Who has to? Do they need a witness?
So depending on how they do it, witnesses definitely helps. Okay. And it's the same thing like a witness for a ketubah. The witnesses can't be related to each other, and they can't be related to the parties involved.
They cannot be related.
They cannot, because in cases like that, the assumption is that they're going to lie because they want to protect their relative.
Mm-hmm. But Rabbi, what I don't recall is any talk of what a widow or widower inherits.
Right. So I didn't get that in here, but in the ketubah, part of the reason that the ketubah exists is to protect the widow. And so it says that, she gets, 200 zuzim or whatever the amount, and that's to protect her. But there are other rules as well to make sure that she's taken care of. But somebody can use any of these sort of legal workarounds to give her more. And you can see that in the link from Hofstra. They get the example that they start with is a couple who created mirroring wills in which they said, if I die, then, my spouse gets everything or half, and, my two children each get a quarter or something like that. And the question is, does their will stand up in terms of halachic things? So, yeah, unfortunately, the way it was designed, the widow was not clearly acknowledged, which is fascinating in itself. That's why some rabbis argue that the ketubah is actually, most, I don't know, a lot of modern people say the ketubah is so outdated, it's sexist, it's all male-oriented, only a man signs it, not a woman. Some rabbis argue, actually, it was very progressive for its time, where it actually put protections in for women. So it's all where you're looking from. Any other questions?
Just one thing. So the whole Torah was supposed to be given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and here we have an instance, as you mentioned, that there's a later amendment.
Yeah.
So how do the Orthodox reconcile that?
I'm not sure. Yeah. My assumption is that they say that, either that Moses was given it, but because of the nature of the situation, he wanted to prove that it was coming from God, or there's a whole variation of opinions. So others say that he was given, broader principles, but not necessarily every exact thing. Mm-hmm. But it is a challenge. There's no question. And the website, the Torah.com, not Torah.com, but thetorah.com, has a lot of articles addressing the issue of Torah from Sinai. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. And the other challenge to that belief is that there are certain places, I think even in this week's Parsha, where it says, God told Moses, to tell the Israelites these laws, which on a simple level sounds like he's saying these laws were not told to Moses to tell the people, or maybe even not told to Moses at all, but now they're being given when he's not on Sinai. Right? Which would suggest that he wasn't given everything. And then the question is, what was he given?
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily undermine the authority, right? Because if it's coming from God, it's coming from God. Who cares if it's on Sinai or not? But it sort of has more power if it came during, this incredible epiphany. I forget the words.
Epiphany.
No, there's another word. There's a special word for when it's a God epiphany. Yes, like a theo epiphany. Kind of gives it more power in people's minds. Well, I'm glad that we have some good engagement, and I look forward to
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What was the name of that website that you mentioned for the articles?
So I have a Facebook page. You can go to Rabbi Sam Kestel on Facebook, and I'll post it there. You'll see the links there.
Thank you.
You got it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Bye.
I'll see you guys tomorrow or soon.
Yes, tomorrow.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.